All right. Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Jurgen Kuipers, and I'm from the Dell Center for System and Control. So welcome to this MSc Defense of Jurgen Kuipers. So Jurgen will present his work he has been doing for his MSc thesis in collaboration with TBM and our department here at the Faculty of 3B. So, so you will do that in 20-25 minutes. And then there will be the opportunity for the audience to ask some questions to Jurgen. And then we will start the closed part of this day. So we'll have the defense. So the committee will ask questions to Jurgen about his work. And then there will be the deliberation, and we'll come up with a mark for the final work of Jurgen. And so then normally, after that, there will be the festive part of this day. So if everything goes well, we'll be able to hand in the diploma, the MSc diploma to Jurgen. So the committee today is made up of Erik Pruijt from TBM, so that's the second supervisor of Jurgen, Manuel Mazo from our department, and Max Otters also from our department, and myself. So, well, now about the timing. So, well, after today there will be the closed part, and the closed part lasts about one and a half hours. So more 1.5 hours, 1 hour 45. So then after that we'll have the festive part that will be in well, in the control room of the CSC, and Jurgen can show you where it is. So wait for us there, and so there. So okay, well, I think I've said everything. So Jurgen, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for your introduction, and thank you all for being here today, showing interest and support for my master thesis. I will talk today about my thesis on model-based exploration of uncertainty in nonlinear systems, which is an application of system and control to exploratory system dynamics. However, my presentation will be centralized around behavior of populations in relation with their environment. And in my thesis, I treated 2 examples on this. One of them is about a predator and a prey population, rabbits and foxes, where the foxes eat the rabbits and they maintain a balance. However, how is it possible that sometimes in nature they do not maintain a balance? And that is what intrigues me. How come these systems show different behavior? It's not always the same. The second example that I treat in my thesis is a system regarding the number of prostitutes based on influence from societal acceptation of prostitution and based on the price of sex services. Also, the behavior of people, humans, animals in their surrounding. So I was looking how I could do that. I was trying to find a way to incorporate that in my master thesis, and I found that with Erik Pruijt in the method of system dynamics. System dynamics does make models, mathematical models of those behavioral issues. However, the interpretation of the models is very difficult because of the fact that human behavior is difficult to measure. And even if you have a measurement, the measurement is hardly ever completely certain. So those models have a lot of uncertainty in them. And that is why the question here is not what will happen. We do not try to predict the future, but we're interested to know what could happen. What are the possibilities? So that's where we're starting off. The current approach in system dynamics does that by looking at what uncertainties do we have and how does that influence the output of a model generated by putting the uncertainties in the equations to the output. However, they hardly use the differential equations in between. And that is where I thought it could be interesting to bring system and control, my personal background, into the picture. So my approach is based on looking at the equations and the influence of uncertainty on them. That leads me to my research question. How can the consequences of uncertainties be explored from the differential equations in those system dynamics models? I will run through that briefly based on a simple two-dimensional model today, the predator-prey, the rabbits and foxes. And secondly, I will show a larger and more complex system dynamics model, which is the prostitution model. So this is a method that could be applied to models that already exist in the system dynamics field, because a lot of modeling is already done to understand society, to understand the possible effects of changes in society. So that makes this research very relevant. The overview of the presentation is as follows. I will first introduce the new approach and then show the results from that. After that, I will show the more complex models and some results for that, and I will close off with a conclusion and recommendations for future work. So here we go. The first example, the two-dimensional model with rabbits and foxes. We see here that the rabbit growth is described by exponential growth in parameter A, and it's limited by a grazing capacity, x1 cap. And that could be interpreted as, for example, a limited amount of grass, so that the rabbits cannot be there with thousands and thousands of rabbits, but they're limited in their size. Then here is the phenomena that rabbits are being eaten by foxes. And here the reverse happens, where foxes eat rabbits and therefore grow their population. And then lastly, there's this part which models the dying of foxes due to old age. So that's the system that we're working with, and I can show a real quick example here that for some parameters, because we need to fill in all those parameters before we can actually run the model. So for some parameters and some initial conditions, this is behavior that can be seen in those systems. We see the rabbits starting at a high point, which means that the foxes have a lot of food. So with some delay, the foxes grow. However, if there's a lot of foxes, then they eat all the rabbits, so that makes the rabbits decline. But then again, they destroyed their own food supply. So the foxes decline as well, and we start all over. So it's an oscillatory behavior. And in this case, probably due to the capacity here, it seems that it levels out to an equilibrium state. This is really neat, but this is again looking at the output of the system. And I am more interested in looking at the equation. So we need a way to visualize or look deeper into these equations rather than a single example. Well, that can be done with such a graph, for example, because here we have the rabbits on the horizontal axis, we have the foxes on the vertical axis, and we see plotted here that if we start here, for example, then first the rabbits go down, we're going to the left, but at the same time the foxes go up, because we're going up. And as the rabbits further decrease, we see that the foxes reach a maximum here. Because after that, they don't have enough food and they start to collapse. That does, however, give the rabbits the chance to repopulate, and that we see the oscillatory behavior again. into indeed an equilibrium point here. But this is not just one output over time. This is a graph of all the possible outputs depending on the initial values for a given parameter set. So if you start here, you can also find the trajectory. And if you start there, you can also find it. So this is a very insightful way to describe the shape of the equations that we're working with. But okay, that's all nice and good and well, but this is just for one parameter set. So we need to find a way to see how this can change over the uncertainties. And for that, I chose in my thesis bifurcation approach. Bifurcations are the changes in properties of equilibrium points. And that is a very influential thought here. The method that I devised first finds the equilibrium points, because you need to know where they are, and then you define properties on those equilibrium points. That is done based on linearizations, which give insight in both the shape of the behavior around the equilibrium and sometimes also about the stability, whether the system wants to go there or whether the system wants to go away from that position. So if we find those properties, and we do this entire method analytically, so without filling in numbers, then the result could be a good description of different modes of behavior based on these parameters that are in the equations. Okay, that's a lot of talk, I realize that. So let's go treat the example to make it more insightful. In the predator-prey model, I found 4 different modes, as I call them, shapes of the very much like the one we treated before, where we have the stable spiral oscillating inwards. And if this occurs, no, the other way around, if the parameters obey this inequality, it is guaranteed mathematically that this shape will occur. And with this shape, I mean that the first equilibrium point here is a saddle point. That means that the foxes will always go down or up from the negative direction, which is not possible here, and that the rabbits will always go away from it. Similarly, the second equilibrium point is also a saddle, converging on the amount of rabbits and diverging on the amount of foxes. That means that if I have 0 foxes, I will just have the rabbits grow until their limit, which makes sense. However, if there's 1 fox there, then the system, the fox will have a lot of food. That means that the foxes grow very fast, and we end up going there. It's a model. It's a model. Good one. It is a model, not just 1 fox, 2 foxes. I'm sorry. In order to reach our second mode, we have to change something, and that means if this inequality no longer holds, that means that if the product of C times x1 cap is smaller than that, we reach a second mode. Now we have that the C1 cap is smaller than this expression, but still larger than D. For example, we could just decrease the grazing capacity and see what happens. Well, this is the second shape. A lot going on there, but we're not still sure, so let's zoom in a little bit. And here we see that now the second equilibrium is still a saddle point, but it moved to the left at 525 rabbits, whereas here it was around 1,000. That means that right now the third equilibrium is pretty close to the second, and well, apparently something changed, because right now it is no longer oscillatory. The system moves there rather smoothly without all the turning. For example, if we start here on the right, we see that the rabbits go down until they reach the point, the horizontal axis, and the foxes just go steadily up until they reach their point. No oscillation anymore. We do see, however, that approaching from this part, the rabbits go down and then a little bit back up, only a little bit. And the same holds for the foxes, but then they go up and they go down a little bit. So it's not all the same shape exactly. We still have different ways of approaching that equilibrium point. And those red lines in there are very special, insightful solutions. They are separatrices, and they can be found as special lines originating from the equilibrium points. So they're all from the equilibrium points in the same holes here. And they help us a lot in actually translating this to output, which the current method does. So it is indeed also applicable to the actual output. But let's for now focus on the shape. So we've seen that putting the system under more pressure, because the limit has now been decreased, prevents the oscillatory behavior. I said there's 4 modes. Unfortunately, I do not have the time to treat all 4 of them, but I can tell you already that in the other modes, the foxes will completely die out. And that is, of course, something that also happens in real life. So that was to be expected. What I can show you now is that combining these inequalities that we found, the parameter space where the uncertainty happens can now be fully split up into regions that lead to the modes. The first inequality here with the spiral can be shown if this term is larger than the blue plane. So that means everything up here will show the spiraling behavior. Well, if you go down one step, we arrive at the second one, and that is between D and the blue expression that we just had. So that is between the red and the blue plane. And then the third will be over here above the green plane, and the fourth will be below the green plane. So this is actually what we've been looking for. This is a one-on-one mapping of the uncertainty to a physical interpretation, the shape of the model, the behavior, oscillations, no oscillations, or the foxes dying out completely. I found 4 different modes in a 2D example already, and these modes can even be split up further in the scenarios, the ways of approaching the equilibrium, so that we can really interpret that very well. So that's it for the first example. This was a very simple model, and already quite some stuff is going on. But let's now look into a real system dynamics model, a more complex model. And that is still a relatively small one. But in order to do that, I analyzed the prostitution model based on the price of sex services and the social acceptation of there being prostitution. There are, however, and that happens very often in system dynamics, conditions on the inflow and the outflow of prostitutes. So that means girls, in this case girls, picking up the job profession of prostitution, and girls leaving prostitution. Because they are modeled separately, they also have to be positive always, because if the inflow is negative, then it becomes an outflow, and we already have that defined elsewhere. So that is why the flow in these systems, the inflow and outflow, are both defined to be the maximum of some expression and 0. And that bothered me because the method I use requires differentiability, and in order to be able to complete the analytic analysis, which allowed me to find the mathematical expressions, I do need the models to be continuous. So that's why I came up with this approach. An approach to deal with that is to split up the model in 2 parts. One reality where the flow is equal to this term, And then the other reality, an alternate reality, where the flow is equal to 0. So we have all the behavior covered. However, I need to know for sure when to switch between those two systems and those two equations. So for that, this guard, a boundary, a switch has been found, again, analytically. So now we have both the model equations here and this boundary. But that is also a function of the uncertain parameters. And that makes it really tricky later on. So I will first show you how that works with a condition on the inflow of prostitutes. Because on the inflow of prostitutes, if the price of sex is higher than the average price of sex, an average price of sex, that is a fixed quantity, an uncertain parameter, then there is actually an inflow of prostitutes. Because, well, being an awkward job, there are people who see benefit in that, maybe. So then there is an inflow, and we see that because this this boundary has been plotted here in 3D, the blue plane. So if the price is higher, then this, the prostitutes can go up. For example, here we see the prostitutes increasing, and here also we see the amount of prostitutes increasing. It doesn't mean that the overall amount of prostitutes has to increase, because there's also the outflow still. So, however, if the price is lower, then there's absolutely no increase in the amount of prostitutes, no inflow. Nobody picks up the job, which is an assumption also. And we see that really clearly that below the blue plane, everything is going down in the amount of prostitutes. And here it's going down and then exiting it. But that means that below this condition, there will never be any prostitutes taking up prostitution. And that could be a very influential notion here, because that might be a trigger to pick up maybe trafficking, human trafficking, or other maybe worse practices. So this is really influential. And in my model, I actually had 3 of these boundaries, 3 of these equations, and that leads to 8 different models. So now we have the blue plane, the green plane, and the red plane. And we see indeed that here's 1, 2, 3, 4, and behind the red plane, another 4 parts, where in each part there's a different model. So it's nice that the new models are now continuous and we can analyze them. However, we have a lot of models. And even worse, these boundaries changed with parameters. So now I got myself into a bit of a tricky problem here. I have to simultaneously look at how the guards change and how the model changes, and that unfortunately was not possible with the current method I had. So I have to be honest there. What was possible here is to analyze just this situation for a set of parameters. So kick out the uncertainty for now, but just get to know the system better in order to be able to work with that a little better. And that's what I'll show in my results right now. We just saw the 3 boundaries and the 8 different models. But for now, let's first look at the first one here in the front, this part. Because in this part, there is a set of equations that describe the behavior. And that can be similarly to the foxes and rabbits, made visual, where we see the equilibrium points all the way in the back, up there in the back. It's nice to know, but in this system where we're looking at only here the front, these equations does describe something that doesn't even happen inside here. What we see here, if we zoom in, we see that that equilibrium point that goes all the way in the back is not inside of this part. And therefore, we already switched models before we reached the equilibrium point. For example, if you're starting here, you go up, and then you exit here. You go up, and you exit. And you go down, and you exit. And once you exit this subpart, the model is no longer valid. So you have to look at the other model where you just walked into. What we do see here, however, and that is very influential in this part, is that because of the fact that we have now a better visualization of what is going on, that we can make new hypotheses to further investigate later on. For example, here it looks as if this separatrix, which was the special solution from the equilibrium point, it looks as if that runs right through the intersection of the green and the blue plane. And that could mean that a lot of the situations that happen inside exit exactly through the intersection there. That is very curious, and it could be worthwhile to investigate that. And because we now have a very direct question, we could also maybe do that with respect to the uncertainty as well. So this gives us the opportunity to prepare for further investigations. Well, in my thesis, I, of course, analyzed all the 8 different submodels and subspaces, but for now, I'll just show you the final result. Bear with me as I walk you through this, this graph. We see here a set of equilibrium points. That is a little bit in the back, because we see if we walk along the right side of this cube, we see that here the price of sex goes up a little bit, the amount of prostitutes decrease. We switch here subspaces, and then we reach the equilibrium point. But the same happens if we start here in the corner. The price goes down to the same level as before, and then we still approach that equilibrium point. Something different happens from the other side, because here the price first goes up, and then the amount of prostitutes increase until we reach the equilibrium point. However, at the left side, and that is behind the red plane, something different happens, because there we're no longer walking in a straight line, because this is a straight line along the side. But here we see that the system is first increasing the social acceptation. That is because social acceptation is very low below the red part. So in order to get to the equilibrium point, it first has to increase as well. And still the same happens, that the price is converging to some part there. So this graph shows that for the chosen set of parameters, the system will always end up here on that line. And that can be very influential, because that means that the other situations will never occur automatically, just out of nowhere. Those are temporary situations that will change into the situation where there's not too many prostitutes, the price is a little bit above average, and the social acceptation is on the high part. So then on towards my conclusions. There we go. In the first part, I've shown that the method performs very well on simple 2-dimensional models with the rabbits and the foxes. But in the second part, I've shown that the 3D model was only explored partly, mainly because of the fact that the conditional functions, the maximum of the value in 0 was in there. So that complicated the analysis. Analysis and visualization of those submodels did prove very valuable, because it gave us a lot of insights to formulate more precise questions. So for further research, that would be a great stepping stone. The system dynamics models can now be subjected to other system and control analyses as well, mainly because of the fact that they are mathematical models. But the changes that I made, the simplification, proved to be an insightful split in different parts that also have different behavior inside of the submodels. So maybe we could even add time varying parameters where people start prohibiting prostitution, and all of a sudden everything becomes illegal and the social acceptation drops to zero. That sort of scenarios can also be explored. So to conclude this all, my thesis should be seen as a proof of concept of an alternative way of working and of bringing system and control and system dynamics together, because that has not ever been done before. On towards the recommendations real quick. It would be really interesting to place the current analyses in system dynamics and the new approach that I suggested besides each other on the same model, and to see what differences and similarities there are and what the techniques can learn from each other. It would be nice to investigate the limits to the new method, because in my 3D example, which was rather complex, I could not analyze the full impact of uncertainty, but maybe there's less complex models that are even larger that could accommodate for the uncertainty as well. I would also investigate specific hypotheses that are derived from the visualization, so to have a more precise approach to the questions that you're asking there. And it would be really valuable to combine actually the new method with the current methods, because you could still do the brute force comparison between the uncertainties and the different outputs. But if you would classify those outputs maybe on the bifurcation theory that I used, that could give way more insightful results. So with that, I hope that I've given you a taste of my application of system and control to system dynamics and the uncertainty in those models.
Let's
Thank you for your time.
I was wondering when you showed some parameter spaces with the frame model, do these areas of the different spaces that you found represent anything about the probabilities with uncertainties?
Very good question. Because of the fact that the uncertainties in these social models are very vague, we do not dare to make a probabilistic estimation of the chance, the probabilistic distribution. We do not want to estimate that, and therefore we cannot apply any probabilistic interpretation to these results. So there is indeed no bigger. I cannot state that there is a bigger chance that the system will be in the big space here compared to the rather small space between those planes. Does that answer your question?
Well, of course, you hope that that model you're using is correct. Maybe it's not very expensive to validate it. Can you use this method that you developed to check whether the model that you use is correct? Does it help validating the model?
To some sense, it could, because if your model is unable to describe scenarios that are actually happening right now in the world, then you know for sure that you're missing something in your model if the purpose of the model is to model all of reality. But if the purpose of the model is just to investigate one specific case or one effect, then it does not necessarily have to show all different types. There could be also behavior modes that are just not feasible in real life. So it could also give you some insight on the assumptions that maybe you made earlier on in modeling. So it could indeed give you valuable feedback on that.
Yeah. Thanks for the presentation. Well, the 3D model is really insightful, also because it is in 3D. Of course, you can see where all the modes are going, but I can imagine that there are far more complex models that are 4D, 5D, 6D, and I think the strength of 3D is that it really makes it insightful for people such as I that don't have a feeling with the random modes. But how do you think it's possible for example, governments to work with 4D models or maybe 5D models to create insightful, how would you say it, scenarios?
Mm-hmm. In order to answer that, for example, this one, we see here that it's stable in all directions, but if we add a third direction or fourth direction to that, we can still know if it's stable or not, maybe pointing outward or pointing inward, because then it is stable. So the mathematics behind it do show stability, instability, in which direction and how, oscillatory or not. So we can still make the classification in different modes. However, interpretation of those scenarios would indeed be more difficult. But if we find the trajectories running along the different dimensions, 3, 4, 5, then from that, sometimes you can infer what is happening on in the 4th, 5th dimension and what makes the scenario different than other scenarios. So that would require some more interpretation, definitely.
Yes. You said you have chosen the bifurcation method. Why did you choose it? And did you have any other options for analyzing the differential equations?
That's a very good question. There is some compared. Well, we're working with nonlinear systems, and there is heaps of literature and research in linear systems, but on nonlinear systems that is way more difficult. There are methods there, but that require usually rather stringent conditions on the type of functions that you have. So I did not find methods different than the bifurcation method that could be applied. There might still be, of course, but also the fact that you're looking at equilibrium points and the procedure can be done fully analytically, make it, for me, argumented that this could be a good approach.
You know, a very last one.
Or maybe not.
Maybe not. Let's thank Jurgen again. Okay, now we'll go for the close session. So for the defense of Jurgen. So it will last about 1.5 hours, maybe a little bit more. So but the next part is in DCC control room. I will also need to let pass the presence list. It should be somewhere. Yeah. Everybody is signed. Thank you.
Ah.